Well, welcome everyone to today's panel on the future of cloud engineering, architectures, and platforms. My name is Luke Hoban. I'm the CTO at Pulumi, and I'm joined today by an incredible set of panelists with deep insights from across the industry who hopefully can share some of their insights on what they're seeing both today and into the near future in terms of the architectures and platforms that are being adopted in the cloud. So to get started, I wanted to sort of invite each one of our panelists to introduce themselves, tell us your name, what you're working on right now, and just for fun, maybe share your favorite database technology. So Corey, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Luke. I'm Corey Scobie. I'm CTO at Chef Software. Most people will know Chef for Chef, but we're also the proprietors of InSpec and Habitat projects as well in the security and application management space. And my favorite database management software is none.
I'm wondering how many good wrong answers we'll have here. I think that is fun. Great. All right. So maybe Al, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Al Sene. I am a VP of Engineering at DigitalOcean. My responsibilities are infrastructure as a service. So I manage all the software teams that develop our compute, network, storage products. And I also have teams that are responsible for our infrastructure management as well. And my favorite database management tool, I would have to say MySQL, I guess.
It's a good safe default answer.
Just because we spend way too much time in there and are way too invested in MySQL.
Great. All right, Joe, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Joe Beda. I'm a principal engineer at VMware. I came to VMware through the Heptio acquisition, and so we're doing this thing called Tanzu, which is bringing together all of VMware's Kubernetes and sort of modern application investments. Previous to that, I was at Google and helped start the Kubernetes project. And my favorite database software, I got two answers here. I'll give you two flip answers. I think, number one is CSV, right? And number two is Excel. I think in general, I'm not smart enough to run a database. So, we'll just say that.
Great. Yep. Awesome. Okay. And then Jason.
Hey everybody, I'm Jason Warner. I'm the CTO at GitHub. Before that, I was the VP of Engineering at Heroku. And I would say that my flippant answer is blockchain for the database. See if anyone's going to torch me for that. But I have to say that, MySQL's treated us well at GitHub, but Postgres treated us incredibly well at Heroku. So I'm going to have to go with those two.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, so to kick off our panel, I think, what we want to cover today is really sort of where folks see, the cloud engineering platforms of the current and the future, and just what you're doing inside your organizations and what you're seeing with the customers that you're working with and where you're seeing companies going. And so one thing to start us off, maybe at Pulumi, I'd say, and really across the industry, we've seen a tremendous uptake of cloud native infrastructures, and a lot of that driven by Kubernetes. And would love to hear how folks think about the impact they're seeing Kubernetes having on the architectures and platforms that are being adopted inside organizations today. And so maybe, Jason, do you want to kind of start off on this one?
Sure, but I'd like to correct that. I hear it's pronounced Kubernetes, and Joe, is that right? Is that how we're supposed to do that?
Well, when we picked the name, we read it and we pronounced it and we went with it. But then, you'll give a talk to folks who actually speak Greek, and they'll start correcting you, and it gets pretty embarrassing pretty fast. But I think Kubernetes, something like that is correct. I'm sure I'm butchering it now also.
So to answer the question though directly, I see a lot of adoption of Kubernetes, and I see people what they're really trying to do is they understand that abstractions are real in the world, and that is the most valuable one they can have in their architecture at the moment. And they're trying to figure out, everyone is talking about hybrid strategies and cross cloud and all of that sort of stuff, but they don't fully understand why they need that yet. So they're trying to hedge a little bit. But Kubernetes is very clearly the front runner of that, and what they're really trying to do. Now, where we sit in the world, where GitHub sits in the world, we're seeing a lot of demand for what I basically call protecting the future self. They don't want to bind themselves into any really bad decisions at the moment, but they want to also keep themselves open for future optionality. And we try to show them how to do that.
Al, how are you seeing things kind of at the infrastructure provider level?
It's big. So we have been using Kubernetes internally for our control plane for a number of years, and we ended up creating a Kubernetes as a service product that we released about a year and a half ago, and we're seeing a lot of adoption from that. And interacting with those customers that are using that, that product. You learn a lot about some of the, some of the flexibility that they have for their environments, and they're able to deploy their containers just about anywhere they want. Certainly we love to have them all, but but we realize that the multi-cloud strategy is facilitated by Kubernetes by so much. It just makes everything so much easier, abstracts everything, simplifies application management, scaling, and all the goodies that that cloud native developers just don't have to worry about. It just is that next level of abstraction and simplification of application development. So we're seeing a very, very big uptake in adoption. Internally, we use it as well. So it definitely helps to have that internal expertise as well, and be able to have those features being used internally to manage our infrastructure as well.
Great. Joe, Corey, either of you, Joe, I'm sure has lots of thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a bunch of impacts that we've seen with Kubernetes. For me, the most interesting thing is like when we talk to customers, it's everything from very small companies all the way up to sort of, huge financials. And when you get to these larger customers, what you find is that, hey, which cloud do you use? And they're like, all of them. Where do you run? Everywhere. And so the name of the game these days for those types of users is that they're just looking for any way to start bringing a layer of consistency, a way of actually starting to approach the sort of intrinsic complexity that they have to deal with. And I mean, hopefully, fingers crossed, Kubernetes ends up being a net positive there in terms of, hey, if you can get teams working on a platform that's Kubernetes based, you have a certain level of consistency across different environments. And it's not going to be exactly the same between DigitalOcean and Amazon and on-prem, but there's enough commonality there that it's not a total retraining as teams, as skills, as people need to move between these different areas. And then the next impact that I think is really interesting is that the distributed models, the distributed control models that Kubernetes embodies have proved useful for managing containers and managing sort of application level stuff. We're starting to see folks use the Kubernetes infrastructure and sort of, distributed system patterns in new ways that go beyond just containers. And I think we're still early on in that journey, but I think it's a really, really exciting journey to be on.
Definitely. Corey, any thoughts on the impact you're seeing from Kubernetes?
Yeah, I think obviously the industry impact is indisputable in terms of how it's affecting not just the way that hyperscale web companies thought about getting applications to their compute infrastructure, but the way now that enterprises are doing it as well. And it has its both its upside and its downside. So, we see companies that have decided that if it's right for Google, it's right for us. And may or may not have the capability to be able to actually pull that off at the end of the day. So I think there's no question that Kubernetes is the most impactful infrastructure kind of compute technology of the modern era. And also it comes with an operational paradigm that is wildly different than the operational paradigm that many of those same customers have experienced over the last 20 years. And so there's a learning curve associated with that as well. So, but to just echo what others had said, the abstraction is really obvious and it helps decouple the development process from the operations process. And I think those things are all good things, right?
Definitely. Yeah, so, I think we talked a little bit about Kubernetes there. I think one of the other trends that we've seen sort of in that sort of compute and platforms layer has obviously been serverless over the last, several years. Curious if anyone here has sort of thoughts on what they're seeing with serverless and how their sort of views on the serverless approach have changed over the last several years. I know this is something that for many people has evolved in interesting ways. So curious what this group thinks about serverless.
Well, I'll go first. So I think, this, with respect to things like Kubernetes, I don't think it's an either or. And I think, I think serverless, the easy place to start is things like function as a service. But honestly, I think that's the least interesting part of what we think about with respect to a serverless model. I think most usage of serverless would be what I would call glue. I mean, when you look at sort of why are people using Lambda, they're taking an event coming from S3 and putting an entry into DynamoDB. And this ends up being sort of like a cloud bash to some degree in terms of being able to just glue some stuff together. The interesting thing for me is that the power of glue goes with the square of the number of things you have to glue together. And so the reason why something like Lambda is so interesting on AWS is because there's a whole heck of a lot of events and there's a whole heck of a lot of services that you can glue together. The opportunity as an industry, though, I think is to actually find a way so that we can have a set of events and a set of services that are open and actually stretch across providers. Because I think we're going to find that if we can develop a thriving ecosystem that crosses these sort of mega cloud boundaries, it's going to be a richer world for everybody, and it'll be bigger than any one single company can deliver.
I'm going to jump in and say I agree with what Joe said entirely. I think that the intellectual possibilities of serverless are amazing, and that they're completely out there. We can have a lot of fun with it, and I love the glue way that he describes it. I would say that our current usage and expectations and how we engage with it is just horrendous. It's a terrible experience, and in fact, it borders on almost neglect to a degree. And
you were so nice about Kubernetes.
I think this has less to do with any one person and more of a feel for why this is important in the first place, and just kind of throwing it out there and seeing what happens with it. And I think that we as an industry probably should agree that it's now time for it to mature from the experience perspective. And the serverless.com is trying to do something and Amazon's trying their own thing. But to your point, Joe, I think if it was a little bit more across the cloud, if we think of it that way as an ecosystem, it would be a better experience. Right now, I feel like you have to buy into a camp. And I think that is my real issue. As an open source enthusiast through and through, as someone who talks about developer experience across everything, I don't really want to buy into any singular camp.
Yeah, I definitely echo the same sentiments. There's definitely a feeling of we have yet to get it right. It seems to me that there are lots of opportunities in the future in terms of how we use it. The idea of having a repository of a bunch of functions that you could run or something of that matter would actually be very cool in terms of how you take open source and just have it be ready to go in some ways as a service. So far, I mean, the usage I've seen has been tied to a particular application, being very specific, but there's definitely a general sense that we're still learning how do we use this, how do we make the most of it. And obviously, as a vendor, it is something that we're approaching and looking at how do we provide something that people can use. I mean, that's who we serve. But certainly as a company that is built on open source and champions open source, we would like to see a larger adoption for sure.
Definitely. All right, so maybe switching gears to another kind of topic. I think one of the things that I'd say we've seen is a lot of organizations, and probably that we've talked to, that I'm sure a lot of you guys talk to, are today building their own sort of platform as a services for their organization on top of either Kubernetes or on top of the other cloud native technologies like serverless framework or things like that. And would love to hear thoughts on, why are we seeing so much reinventing of the wheel in this platform layer? Why is every organization building their own one of these? Why haven't we as an industry helped to kind of move that layer of abstraction up? And maybe I'll throw out to Jason to start, since I know you've had experience working in one of the platforms that has made some progress.
So at Heroku, obviously, as one of the premier platform as a service in the world, we used to joke that every time we walk into an organization, we're going to see some variant of a platform as a service inside that organization. And I think that people build it just, to be honest with you, that because it's easy and it's fun to do it to a degree. It's the 80% versus the 100% problem. 80% of this is likely quite fun and rather easy to do. You can get going really quickly. And Kubernetes is a good example of where in the past 2, 3, 4 years, it's made it incredibly easy to get to that point. It's the refinements in the last 20% that make it incredibly difficult to get right. Now, do I think that organizations should do this? I'm definitely not against them doing it. I just think that they should go into it wide-eyed. It's the equivalent of making a database. You know, the first 80% of a database is really straightforward and easy to do. The last 20%, if you're going to throw this into production and shard it and scale it across multi-geos, is going to be a nightmare. And you're going to have to invest billions of dollars into that. Is that what you actually want to do?
Yeah, you know, it depends. It's funny, Jason, you mentioned the database analogy, and like I have this very fond memory of a long time ago in my career being at eBay and having the CTO of eBay at the time tell me that if he could make one change about eBay's distributed web architecture, it would be that he would have his own database, because for every $1 that they took in, eBay had to give their database vendor 30 cents of it, right? And so, and like
that was.
I'm not gonna call out anybody in particular, but you can imagine, but also like that's a super valid business reason to do it. To your point on PaaS, right? We've gone through this period of democratization of decision making in enterprise IT, where basically the CTOs and CIOs of the world have taken the chains off their teams and said, go and make decisions. And there's this incredible world of software that's available out there and parts and pieces, but it's all a bunch of Lego kits, and people are forced to pull it together, and so they pull it together in a pattern that they think fits for them. But the big challenge that many of the customers that we see at Chef having right now is that they have so many patterns in their organization that they can't operationalize anything at scale, because everything's a unicorn, right? Like everything is a pet, and there's no cattle left anymore. Yeah. And so I think, you know, the power of being able to pull all this open source software together and build your PaaS that fits your organizational dynamics and everything is so alluring to folks. But the downside of it is that this democratized decision making has created sort of like enterprise chaos at some level. And we believe that there is a period of sort of a correction period that we're entering now, where people are looking at ways to simplify the number of patterns that they have to manage at scale operationally. And whether that's to build a PaaS of your own or buy somebody's kit out of the box or whatever, like there's an opportunity there in the industry for sure.
And I would like to add one thing to what you said there, Corey. I think, interestingly, the size and scale and sophistication of your organization is one of the more crucial questions to answer inside this. I can't tell you how many organizations I see that are 2 people, and they said, well, we'll get our product out the door once we fix X, Y, and Z about our infrastructure. And I just don't understand why they just don't throw it into Heroku or DigitalOcean and use Rails right out the door or something like that, and then work on getting the product market fit and then going to it. But eBay building their own database makes more sense, but that 2-person startup making their own database doesn't make any sense. So it has to do with where you are in that growth function too.
So Corey, you mentioned the period of correction. I'm curious if others have thoughts on what that period of correction might look like. First, if you agree that we're sort of entering that period where there might be some more consolidation here inside organizations, and if so, what do you think it would look like?
I think a key part of the story there around correction comes down to security and compliance. It's all fun and games until, you know, you have some sort of breach. And so, you know, we do a lot of work with financials, you know, there is a certain level of like, you know, where is that sweet spot around empowering developers and application teams with a cloud-like model where they can, you know, I like to call cloud like, you know, not talking to a sales guy as a service, right? Like the key part of cloud is that I can get my job done without having to file a ticket or talk to anybody. So I think the holy grail here is like, how can we have that experience for app teams so they can run hard, but how can we do it in the context and the constraints that are often very unique to each enterprise, right? And so you end up with, you know, I cut my teeth at Microsoft, and, you know, back in the day where he's like, why does Word have all these features that like I don't use? And the answer is that, you know, they did studies in like the average person uses maybe 20% of the features of Word. Everybody uses a certain 10%, and then everybody else uses a different 10%. And I think this is one of the things that makes it difficult, in complex scenarios to end up with any sort of one-size-fits-all solution for deploying and managing infrastructure. So those are some of the things that I think drive people to want to create their own experiences. But it's not easy. And I agree with Jason that you got to go in eyes open and know what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah, the complexity is, I don't know if we're entering a period of correction, but the complexity is continuing to increase. At the same time, we're getting more abstraction. So there's like this contradiction that is happening in the industry right now, where every time you turn around, there's a new package out there that is doing something specialized, but it is abstracting things in many ways, right? Nobody is a true computer scientist anymore. Everybody's, operating at a much higher level than they were before. So, I mean, I don't know. For me, it is exciting to continue to see the simplification of software engineering, that we're building stuff much faster with an increasing level of complexity. There are lots of great advances and things that you can spin up today within, a few minutes. Is mind-boggling, in terms of what it used to take to actually deliver value in the past. So I'm wondering if maybe what is apt to happen is more of a meta architecture, where there are these big types of building blocks that we all end up grabbing from, and there's some variety there to match our specific application. But I agree that there's the increasing complexity overall is ripe for some methodology or some way of thinking that would actually simplify it a little bit or make it more tangible.
All right. So it was the next question kind of, it was mentioned a few times. I think both Jason and Joe mentioned about sort of multi-cloud, earlier in the conversation. And we'd love to get folks' thoughts on sort of what they see the future of multi-cloud looking like. Will we see sort of increased levels of consistency across the cloud providers? Will it be Kubernetes that is the level of consistency? Do we think specific industries will see more, penetration around multi-cloud architectures? Where do you see multi-cloud going over the next few years?
Well, as a cloud vendor, I like to believe that multi-cloud is going to continue. What I see with a lot of our customers, they use multiple clouds as a way to manage availability, as a way to deal with pricing, as a way to deal with POPs around the world. I mean, there's a number of different ways that people use multi-cloud technology to actually the approach to architect the application. So, certainly Kubernetes has been super helpful in facilitating that kind of approach to deploying an application for sure. Whether there's consolidation in the future, who knows? But I think variety is good. Variety, increases innovation, increases competition, and frankly, it just makes things more interesting.
I'd like to add on there, and I think I don't see a real compelling reason that cloud vendors would choose to standardize their interfaces or their service offerings across the clouds, at least today in today's landscape. And so for the foreseeable future, I think there'll continue to be drift in the different types of service offerings and the implementation of those service offerings over time. I do think that that the abstractions that are coming along and in terms of how developers interact with the cloud's services and resources underneath are going to continue to put like the actual location of your workload further and further away from sort of the tip of the spear with developers. And what I mean by that is that, the most advanced organizations that focus on things like zero trust are not actually going to care where a developer chooses to put a function or a workload, right? Because they'll have a level of security consistency and access controls across the various different environments. And so therefore, like the business is going to care less ultimately about this physical location that things operate in, and they're going to care more about, you know, being able to leverage across different environments. And that means both things that they place, investments that enterprise makes in their own cloud architecture, and also the investments that they may make in public cloud providers as well. So I think that I think we're a ways away from seeing a material paradigm shift, because today most enterprises view it as, look, I'm going to be an AWS customer and I'm going to get a virtual private VPC in that environment, and I'm going to go and put my stuff in there. And I think in the future, with the right work, you know, on the security side, with the right work on the sort of the operational side, they're going to have less opinion about where things operate and more opinion about the efficacy and the efficiency of what they get out the other side of the transaction.
And I would say my thought here is there's the way in which I maybe think things should go, and the way they're likely to go, and also what you mean by multi-cloud too. I mean, we talk about the big three and how they provide compute, or we can talk about what's going on with some of the CDN networks and what they're doing with computed edge and some of the transition there. Or we can, you know, there's a theoretical thought exercise where all of the compute, you know, the big three compute look more like internet providers in the future, and the innovations happening on the other side of the on the other side of the line. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm an optimist and a builder, so I think it should go a certain way, because you want to give developers and organizations a certain thing. But I also don't think it's going to move as fast as I would hope it does as well. And I think the industry will actually look a lot more like it does today in 5 years, just with better tooling and operations of things.
Jason, when I said abstractions, I was looking at you and thinking actions. So
I think, you know, if we rewind the clock 5 or 6 years, everybody thought that there was going to be one big cloud and everybody was going to run it, and there'd be like one data center per continent and we were going to be done. And clearly that's not where we're at. I think, you know, what I see is that the infrastructure footprint for enterprises is just getting more and more complex. You know, whether you're talking about data sovereignty or sort of geopolitical issues, that's a force that's causing people to actually go wide. For specialized workloads, whether you're doing machine learning or, you know, I don't know, graphics rendering or what have you, there are certain cases where, you know, it does make sense to maybe manage your own data center. And then I think there's the whole thing around edge and all its various different types of things. I love the idea of the CDN as being sort of a low latency cloud, and we're seeing that start to evolve. But, you know, you take a look at, like, you know, Amazon's doing these stores with, you know, cameras everywhere. If you've been to one of these Amazon Go stores, you look up and it's just like a layer of cameras. I don't think every retail establishment is going to look like that, but it's going to be somewhere on that spectrum, and they're going to need compute to be able to do that, because you can't always get the backhaul that you want to your data center to be able to handle that. So whether you're talking telcos, CDNs, retail edge, you know, shippers want to be able to have infrastructure at their distribution center so that they can actually download stuff to their trucks and stuff, right? Like, it's like this world is just getting more and more complex. And I think that, you know, multi-cloud as a term, I think stands in for just dealing with the full complexity of the entire IT estate.
Can I add one more thing to pile on to what Joe said there, which is I think security and compliance are really going to have an impact on this whole conversation too. The whole geopolitical thing is, it's super complex. I mean, I have a premise that the rise of chief compliance officers is going to become a thing, because it is super difficult to navigate this landscape and changes all the time.
Yeah. All right. In terms, you know, I think we just talked about a few of the sort of technology shifts, especially around the edge and things like that. Curious, you know, kind of going down a layer in terms of the hardware. Obviously, the hardware that we have available is shaped significantly, you know, what the cloud looks like today and how we're building out modern cloud technologies. Curious if folks have any thoughts on sort of any interesting shifts they're seeing in the hardware landscape that are going to have an impact on kind of the platforms and technologies that we're using in the next few years.
I think machine learning in devices is going to be a big change. I think being able to shift some of the stuff that you could only do in data centers with big models to something that can be done on devices is going to be a big change. I think 5G is going to be a big change in terms of, orders of magnitude more bandwidth and accessibility to connectivity. I don't think anybody knows exactly what that change is going to look like. It's just going to be different.
Yeah. I'll just add too. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the 5G was the one I was going to key in on and say I think that's going to have an impact. And I don't know if it will, but you're going to at some point have mobile. All the cars that we have running around, all the Teslas running around, all the other EVs are going to be, there are going to be some mobile units. Who knows what's going to happen there? The phones are just getting more powerful. Obviously, the machine learning is the 5G and machine learning are the two big ones that we're going to see. The rise of the TPUs and the rise of what's going to happen over there with 5G. So other than that, I'm not a hardware guy.
I think what we're seeing though is like there's an interesting inversion that's happened, because if you think back, and I'll age myself here, but if I think back 15 or 20 years in this industry, what you had was hardware defined what was happening on the software and services side of the world. And I actually think that the hyperscale web companies kind of pioneered the idea that hardware doesn't just come in one shape and size, and that you could specialize it into specific workloads, and the work that Facebook and Google have done in their own data centers to build hardware that was fit for the kinds of operations that they need. And I think what we're going to continue to see now is increasingly specialized hardware that's coupled to the software side of the house, as opposed to being hardware driving what's on the software side of the house. Like, nobody speaks about Moore's law anymore, right? Because nobody cares about what the compute capacity of an individual processor is, because we don't think about the world in that way anymore. As software architects, we think about there's an unlimited amount of compute out there. All I need to do is figure out how to interface that with the software that I'm building for the workload that I'm building. So I think we'll continue to see hardware evolve as being the trailing function of requirements that are coming out of the cloud world, out of the software world, out of the compute world, as opposed to the opposite.
Yeah, I just want to add that the advances we're seeing with GPUs and certainly on the networking side as well with regards to smart NICs, I mean, those are technologies that are actually going to make a lot of difference. And, the speed to which the GPU world is evolving, where every year and a half they have a whole new generation. I mean, the things are advancing so fast that it is bound to have huge impact on what we can do from an ML standpoint or data sciences and things of that nature. So those are going to enable a wave of innovation like we've never seen before. And with 5G, you're effectively going to have a machine learning device, next door, right? I mean, your car is going to have so much power in terms of what it can do. It's really interesting how the innovation that we're seeing today is really accelerating. It's amazing.
Great. And then kind of moving up the stack, I think, Corey talked about how software is really taking an even more sort of driver's seat role here in the cloud, the way that that's exposed through the cloud vendors and things. So curious what folks are seeing in terms of, cloud native and modern cloud technologies and projects that you think are kind of having a big impact today and that are going to have a big impact over the next few years in terms of the ultimate experience that the cloud engineers have with these platforms.
I'll get started here. I think we're going to see an evolution of sort of application architectures on how people actually build applications that can take advantage of the extended capabilities that we see. Back in the day, it was all 3-tier sort of CRUD apps. It was like, you got a database, you got a presentation layer, maybe you were using Rails to get this stuff going. And then we had this whole sort of evolution around big data. And I think now we're seeing kind of a merging of these things where we now have some standard patterns for how you actually deal with fire hoses of data in a sane way. And being able to make this sort of, these sort of reactive type of programming models work, and making that be easy and accessible where you don't have to have a computer science PhD to build distributed systems. I think that's something that's really enabled and empowered with cloud. I think one of the fascinating things when I was at Google was that, we would talk with research scientists in research labs, and they didn't have nearly the resources that we had, just sort of, between the couch cushions at Google. And so I think the accessibility of scalable infrastructure for everybody, I think we're still, that was an early result of cloud when, early EC2 usage was the New York Times scanning its back catalog and doing OCR, right? We're still, I think, early in terms of understanding and building consumable, accessible ways for building distributed systems.
On that front, I think, service mesh type architectures are actually being, very helpful in simplifying that distributed system, paradigm, right? You can deploy an application out there and have it all be managed for you and scale up and down and so on. So, it seems to me that the simplification is continuing, that is becoming easier and easier to do some of these things. I think a lot of the setup today is a little too complex still for people that are not hardcore developers. But I can foresee a time where it'll be super easy to just deploy an application and have it be distributed and worldwide and have CDNs involved, and all of that is just a few clicks of a button for a developer.
To echo what them said, I think that there's a natural evolution that happens in software over periods of time, and we've all gone through various versions of this. But there's when a new technology comes out, a new paradigm, a new shift, and it kind of explodes, and a whole bunch of things happen, and complexity kind of reigns everywhere, and then it gets consolidated back down to a core set of principles and primitives that happen. And I think we're essentially in the explosion phase for a bunch of different things, and it'll get consolidated back down here soon on a couple of different concepts. Good example of this is I cannot program in Java anymore. Too much scar tissue from J2EE and Java server faces and all that sort of stuff. The complexity from the early 2000s that exploded. And then when I found Rails and Ruby and just fell in love with it because it brought some simplicity back. Well, we're having a very interesting explosion that's happening in frameworks and things of that nature, but also services. Services have now gotten easy to write services, but the complexity of managing services. And if you look at it, there's an interesting thing that's happening at the moment, which are a lot of the 2008, 9, 10 unicorn, decacorn startup companies, and Google's an example I think plays in here, is they wrote internal systems or services or things to manage the complexity of their business because it didn't exist. And a lot of those people are actually spinning out and making new companies or products, and this is largely what's happening with the Cloud Native Foundation landscape. And they're bringing some of that simplicity to everyone else. Well, we're still kind of, I think, in an explosion of complexity phase before the back to simplicity reigns in.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jason. But it's starting to come back together. Like the Big Bang has kind of happened and the expansion happened, and it's you could definitely see it starting to come back together. I think, when I look at, we were talking about serverless earlier, and for all of its good and bad and everything else, the fact that you could take an engineer of virtually any experience level and say, build me a massively scalable data ingress system out of serverless and a cloud database capability is so democratizing to the companies that aren't the hyperscale web companies of the world, that don't have an unlimited amount of resources and don't have an unlimited amount of money to throw at those problems, right? And so, and what I think is going to happen, particularly with CNCF, is the goodness that has come to building those kinds of interfaces, those kinds of interactions in the public cloud is going to become available to enterprises to run in their environments as well. As Jason describes it, the explosion starts to come back together and reform into more operationalizable technology.
Definitely. So, just to wrap up, would love to give everyone a chance just to kind of give any parting thoughts they have, as you think about cloud engineering and the future of kind of what people are going to do with architectures and platforms. What are your last parting thoughts for folks in this space?
I'll start. At Chef, we have a sort of a hypothesis that one of the things that's going to happen in cloud engineering in general and in infrastructure management and in software development is that most companies are going to start to go through, again, this period of consolidation, but ultimately what it means is to reduce the number of patterns that they have for operationalizing the various different things that they have to a smaller number of patterns. And if you look at the way that, the big technology players operate at scale and velocity, like the Amazons and the Googles and the Facebooks and the Netflixes of the world, they have hundreds of thousands of software developers working on tens of thousands of projects simultaneously, but they only have a small number of ways that those projects actually get to operational state, right? Like the funnel gets narrow very quickly, and there's a small number of patterns that they operationalize at. And so our advice to enterprise customers that are looking to try and get that kind of efficiency and effectiveness out of their IT organizations is that you have to try and reduce the number of patterns that you're going to support in the long term. And we see that happening now, but I couldn't give that advice enough times to enough CIOs out there, which is, if what you want is web scale efficiency and output, what you have to do is reduce the number of patterns that you're supporting at any given time, right? So that's my parting piece of advice.
So Corey touched on very large enterprises and customers. I'll go to the other side. I think for people that are coming out of school, future developers, future entrepreneurs, there's going to be this continued simplicity and simplification and abstraction of the development environments and tools, and standing up applications of massive complexity will be something that people will be able to do at the drop of a hat. And we'll see people have an idea and get it spun up super quickly in ways that it would have taken years in past years for somebody to develop. So for me, I'm certainly very excited to see all these developments in computer science, because it is actually allowing a lot of people to have access to technologies for standing up and creating businesses and developing new innovations and so on. I went to a conference in Africa, in Ghana, back in December, before the world went on lockdown, and there was just this huge energy. There was 3,000 people at this conference, and a lot of them were still at school and building enterprises, and they were all super excited about Kubernetes. I can only imagine where something like this would be in 5 years or 10 years from now. So that simplification, that abstraction, that innovation in the tools is really going to provide access to a lot of people, and we'll see a lot of innovation over the coming years for sure.
I think it would only be fair that we let Joe have the last word on this topic, so I will go next. But I think that if I can offer any parting advice for folks is, it's almost inevitable that you get to complexity in what you're building and where you get to, but don't do it too soon. Don't do it too early. Graduate into it. And I think that with what we see out there, it's a great time, one, to be in infrastructure tech and be building infrastructure tech. I think it's a lot of fun. And two, it's kind of having its own renaissance in terms of everywhere is being innovated. If you're a large enterprise, I would say also, don't buy all the hype you hear. Ask your developers internally and ask other developers about what's happening actually in the market. Because there is a lot of stuff that will be said in the next 5 to 10 years about things that you likely don't need. And then developers, don't get saddened or frustrated or upset about things that are happening of other parts of the stack. I can't navigate the JavaScript frameworks anymore. It used to be, I used to write vanilla JavaScript all the time. It's just not my thing anymore. And it's had its own Cambrian explosion. I can't follow it. I'm not that upset by it. I just know there's a lot of smart people caring after it, and that's what I really care about.
So there's two things that I want to leave with. The first is, I'm fundamentally, I think, an optimist. It's hard to be during this time, but I think I'm fundamentally an optimist. And I think there's a bit of a nihilistic view that we're just moving complexity around. And that, hey, if we do this thing, we're making this more complex, but we're making this thing easy, and it ends up being a zero-sum game. But I keep reminding myself, that old saw, like we taught sand to think, right? Like there is so much complexity in our stack that we're not even cognizant of, and we've done amazing things as an industry, and there's no reason to think that won't continue, and we won't find ways to, innovate and find ways to sort of, just fundamentally make things simpler, and it's not a zero-sum game around moving complexity around. And then the last thing is, I think it's got to be about community. I think we got to work to build ecosystems that, again, create positive sum environments for everybody, such that, as an industry, we're bigger than any single vendor, we're bigger than any one company. The work that I'm trying to do, working with a lot of folks at VMware around Tanzu is, you look at this complex, confusing, I call that CNCF landscape diagram, the beautiful chaos, right? That's a sign of innovation. We want to partner with our customers so that we can, give them an on-ramp into this environment so that they can benefit from it, but not cut them off from it. And I really want to see, everybody embrace, like, how can we work together to build something that's bigger than any single one of us could.
Very, very well said, and couldn't agree more. So thank you very much to all of the panelists here. I think it's been a great conversation, lots of really good insights from all of you. And thanks again, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Bye.
Thank you.